Hello, everybody. Welcome to another presentation in the UCLA Center for Behavior, Evolution, and Culture speaker series. My name is Clark Barrett. I'm the director of the UCLA Center for Behavior, Evolution, and Culture, and I'm organizing the series this year. If you are interested in finding out more information about our center, you can Google us, and our site is at bec.ucla.edu. This speaker series runs every Monday throughout the academic year, with the exception of holidays. And I am recording most of the talks in the series, which will be posted on our YouTube channel, which is UCLA Beck on YouTube. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to give you a preview of our talk for next week. Our speaker is Tyler Margettis, who's an assistant professor of cognitive and information sciences at UC Merced and a fellow at the Santa Fe Institute, and his talk is called A History of Our Times. And it is on cognition about time. So please join us next week if you're interested in that. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Nadya Vasilyeva, who is a postdoc here in the Department of Anthropology at UCLA, and is a postdoc on the Geography of Philosophy project, which is funded by the Templeton Foundation. Nadya's talk, which is, do you want to share your screen, Nadya, at this point? Mm-hmm. And I'll read the title of your talk. Nadya's talk is called Thinking About Social Groups and Social Structures. If you'd like to unmute yourself for a moment, let's please join me in welcoming Dr. Nadya Vasilyeva. All right, Nadya.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. I'm excited to share about my work. I'm a psychologist. Actually, if you think about it, it's funny. I'm a psychologist at the anthropology department funded by a philosophy grant. So hopefully we'll all figure out how these pieces fit together. So let me start by telling you about one personal experience. A couple of years ago, I moved from Berkeley, California to Princeton, New Jersey, and I noticed a few differences. One was that while most grad students and postdocs in Berkeley compost their food, composting is a lot less common in Princeton. And you might have some intuitive theories about the kind of people who go to Berkeley and the kind of people who go to Princeton that might explain this difference. They might have different core values. Maybe people in Berkeley value sustainability and being close to Mother Earth, while maybe Princetonians value other things. Well, it also turns out that in Berkeley, the city offers a free composting program to all residents, providing composting bins and weekly pickup. But in Princeton, you need to register, fill a bunch of forms, and pay a monthly fee for the composting service, which makes it a lot less accessible to students and postdocs. This stable structural difference between the two environments offers an alternative explanation of the observed group differences. We do not need to postulate any deep essential differences between them to make sense of it. In other words, when the structural differences exist, we may observe different outcomes, even if the people inhabiting the two environments are otherwise identical. And in fact, when I moved from Berkeley to Princeton, I admit I stopped composting, even though, to the best of my knowledge, I was essentially the same person. And now that I'm back in California, I'm composting again. So the first way of explaining the group differences in terms of deep essential characteristics has been well examined in psychology. Structural thinking, in contrast, has only recently attracted attention. So when we think structurally, we're construing some properties of social categories as products of stable structural constraints. So to give you an example of how these another example of how these two types of thinking apply to a more common case, let's consider following observation. Women often quit jobs after having children. An internalist explanation of this observation might cite women's preferences, priorities, capacities, whereas a structural explanation, in contrast, could go like this, that women, by virtue of their position in the social structure defined by gender wage gap, lack of paid parental leave, and affordable childcare, are constrained in their choices in such a way that quitting a job becomes one of the few rational and feasible options. And there are plenty of other examples. For example, there is a correlation between race and incarceration rate, and an association between gender and math achievements, such that there are fewer women with advanced math degrees and in tenured math positions. So do we conclude that these correlations are due to something inherent about members of these categories? Is it that some races are inherently predisposed to crimes and women are inherently less capable of succeeding at math? Or could it be something about different positions within the social system, each with its own opportunities and barriers? The explanations we pick can have important real-world consequences for whether these patterns are perpetuated or not. So imagine a little girl who learns that there are fewer women in math. If she thinks that that reflects preferences and capacities inherent to the category that she belongs to, she might be more likely to shy away from math. And add to that the effects of explanations endorsed by her teachers and people in charge of college admissions and tenure reviews, and you may start seeing how our explanations shape the world we live in. Now, at this point, you might be thinking this all sounds familiar. Isn't there a long history in psychology of looking at how people attribute behaviors to persons versus situations, or sometimes to stimuli? So for example, if one of you fell asleep during my talk, is it something about that person or is it something about my talk? Now, on this class of models, to answer this question, you would look at patterns of covariation. Is that person falling asleep at all talks? Then it's probably something about them. Or if everyone is falling asleep during my talk, then it's probably something about me and my talk, right? But that's where the catch is. All this class of models assumes that you have access to a full factorial design with data from all these combinations varying across all these three dimensions, as you would in a good experiment with three independent variables. In contrast, in this line of my work, I'm studying how people deal with cases when you don't have this kind of data. You only get to see one category in one type of situation, in other words. Like you only get to see that person at one talk, or you only get to see women in one social context. This emphasis on confounds between categories and their social positions sets apart the questions that I study in this line of work from the classical person-situation dichotomy. Structural thinking, as I define it, is a special case of situational thinking, and I have some data showing that it differs from kind of the plain vanilla situational thinking, but I won't be talking about that data unless you ask me in the Q&A. So when you form representations of groups under the internalist construal, you form a representation of the category and you store the features that characterize this category. So for example, for women, you can store characteristics like women, most women, many women have ovaries, women work as nurses, not math professors, and you store these features as properties of the category, whereas under the structural construal, you have a separate representation of the social position, and some properties attached, they are derived from that social position. And the category, which can also have its own properties, is perceived as occupying that position. It can be a very kind of sticky occupier. You only get to see it in that position, but it's not the only possible position for it. So the key difference is kind of where you mentally attach the properties of social groups to the category occupying the position or to the position. And just to flag it, the internalist versus structural distinction goes beyond social categories. I think it's a general claim about categorical representation, but I'm focusing on social categories as a good test case for examining this type of reasoning. So we can hypothesize that the difference in representation will lead to differences in how people reason about the categories and their properties. So when a property of a social group is construed as a product of the category essence, and when I say essence, I really it's a much broader claim about inherent factors or kind membership per se. That type of construal allows for thinking about properties of the category as to some extent defining it. So you could mention that property in a definition of the category. Whereas for this, when the property is attached to the social position, the properties should not be seen as in any way defining of the category itself. Now, in contrast, the properties attached to the social position should seem dispensable. You could remove those properties, and the category still remains its proper self. So you can still be a proper category member even if you don't have those properties. Whereas if the properties attached to the category itself, they're seen as kind of essential in some sense. If you lose those properties, you're losing a bit of category essence. You're less of a category member. Now, besides these differences in representation, I think there's some very interesting commonalities between internalist and structural thinking. One is we can hypothesize that both should support formal explanation. And the word formal here, I'm using it not as it's used in the computational literature. This term comes from philosophy, where it means simply that you're explaining a property by citing category membership. Like when I say, why is that thing striped? I say, oh, because it's a tiger. Now, a person holding certain essentialist sexist beliefs might say that she didn't get tenure in math because she's a woman, using this term here to refer to an essentialized category. But interestingly, a person who uses the term woman to refer to the social position could actually also explain problems with achieving tenure in math by citing that profile of barriers that this person is facing in virtue of the position that has its own affordances and barriers. Likewise, we hypothesize that both construals should support generic expressions. So again, our sexist friend here could say women have trouble getting high-level managerial jobs to mean that women just inherently don't cut it when it comes to becoming CEOs. And interestingly, this is the meaning that the dominant theories of generic language assume. They may disagree on what we should do about it. Some say we maybe should stop using generics so much, but they agree that this is what the meaning that generics convey. However, I'd like to argue that generic statements could convey something very different. Again, you could totally hear an outraged race and gender activist saying the same sentence: women have trouble getting high-level managerial jobs, except that this person here uses the word woman to refer to the social position, which completely changes the meaning. So generics, like formal explanations, are ambiguous in a very interesting way. The final commonality is that both internalist and structural thinking should support generalization and prediction, because they both establish some kind of non-accidental connection between belonging to the category and maybe being stuck in a position where the category is stuck and having certain properties. So no matter whether you have an internalist or structural construal, in virtue of learning that a person is a woman, you could predict that maybe she has higher chances of quitting a job after having a child than a member of a different category, although you endorse very different explanations for why that might happen. So to add to our list of predictions, we expect both construals to support formal explanations, generic statements, and generalization. Except these set of predictions are based on different explanations. In one case, you're predicting all of those things based on shared category membership, whereas in the other case, based on shared social position. So today I will present several studies. The first part will report, in the first part of my talk, I will report 3 studies with adults. So actually in total, I will tell you about 6 studies, but I will only show you details and data for 3 of them, and I will only present highlights for 3 of the studies. So for study 1, we'll go over study 1 in some detail, and then for study 2 and 3, I'll only give you the highlights in this part. So the main goal of study 1 was to document different profiles of internalist and structural thinking across judgments, including category definition, dispensability, and formal explanation. This was a study with adults recruited on Amazon MTurk, who learned about a novel social category, Barunians. So they were introduced as a fictional group of immigrants who came to a new country, Kemi, and got established there. Participants learned 6 internalist properties of Barunians. For example, it would say things like Barunian traditions are extremely important to them and form part of their identity. For example, Barunians have a special tattoo on one arm. And in this study, we used internalist properties that were all kind of social in nature. And in subsequent studies, we included more biological properties. participants also learn 6 structural properties of Baronians. For example, we'd say here a few characteristics that they have due to their position in Chemi society and governmental policies that apply to them. Baronians are allowed by the government to run small artisan retail businesses in Chemi without getting a special permit, so they open many small stores selling artisan artwork. And in this experiment, we use different sets of features as examples of internalist and structural properties and pretest and match them on other characteristics such as category and key validity. And in subsequent studies, we use the same features and vary explanations to manipulate whether a property is construed as internalist or structural. So after participants learned the properties of this new category of fictional category of immigrants, we asked them to make several judgments. The definition judgment presented them with this short exchange when someone asks, what is a Baronian? And the response is, a Baronian is a person who, and then we insert the property. For example, a Baronian is a person who runs a small store selling artisan artwork. And we ask, how good is this answer? We predicted that structural properties should receive low ratings because, again, these properties are not attached to the category itself. They're just attached to the position. So they shouldn't be good candidates for defining the category, whereas internalist properties should receive higher ratings. In the feature dispensability judgment, participants were asked to imagine an alternative world where the people we call Baronians do not have this property, and we say, when we ask, from your perspective, would you call them really and truly Baronians? And in this case, we expect that structural properties should receive higher ratings than the internalist properties because losing a property that's just attached to your position is not in any way damaging to your category membership. A loss of internalist property, in contrast, should be more costly for proper membership in that category. And finally, we asked participants to evaluate some formal explanations. Participants saw, again, a short exchange. Someone asks, why does he run a small store selling artisan artwork? And the response is because he's a Baronian. In this case, we expected that both internalist and structural properties would receive similar ratings, although for different reasons, as we discussed earlier. So we have these, so far, 2 profiles, different sets of predictions for the 2 types of properties. You may notice that both internal and structural, internalist and structural construals predict endorsement of formal explanations. In such cases, it's nice to have a control where you expect something different to happen. And luckily, we know that there is one specific kind of properties that do not support formal explanations. So for example, if I asked you, why is this red? And someone said, because it's a barn, that's not a great explanation. Being red is an incidental property of barns. And prior research shows that this merely statistical or incidental associations do not support formal explanations. People think they're bad in this case. So we included incidental properties for Baronians. We said, here are some statements that are true, but there's nothing about these features that tie them to Baronian culture, tradition, personality, or anything about their place in Chemi society. For example, they barbecue a lot and they buy a lot of barbecuing coal all year round. We expected that formal explanations would not work well for such features. Like you wouldn't say, why does this person buy a lot of barbecuing coal? Because he's a Baronian. We also thought this feature should be pretty dispensable and they should not support definitions. So we have these 3 unique profiles across our features. And now kind of translating this check marks into, we expect a high rating here and crosses into, we expect a low rating here. If we look for each task, we could say that coding internalist, imagining the data that we're going to get in the internalist condition as blue bars and the data we're going to get from the structural condition as green bars and incidental condition gray bars. We expect this kind of high, low, low profile for the definitions across the 3 types of properties, and then low, high, high for dispensability and high, high, low for formal explanations. And these are the actual results that we got for definition judgment as expected, and then for dispensability, and then finally for the formal explanations. So as you see, the precise set of the precise patterns that we predicted, in fact, emerged in the data. So to summarize the study, we see that structural thinking produces a unique reasoning profile about category properties when we construe such properties as stable structural constraints. They're perceived as non-defining, dispensable, and supporting formal explanation, which is different from both internalist and incidental features that each display a different profile across these three judgments. And as a kind of methodological note, the structural construal was easily elicited with explanatory cues. We did not have to train people to reason in a structural way. So now moving on from study 1 to study 2. And again, as a reminder for studies 2 and 3, in this section of the talk, I'll just give you the highlights. So in study 2, we want to see how the two construals support generic statements. And we've argued that generics are ambiguous because you can use category label to refer either to the category itself or to its stable position. So you could say something like women have trouble getting tenure in math to refer to the essentialized category. So in other words, you would be saying women by virtue of being women have this property. Or you could make the same claim about the social position shaped by structural constraints, and you would say women by virtue of their position in our society have this property. So in this study, we introduced a new group of participants to two fictional groups of immigrants again, and they learned about them from generic statements. So they learned things like Burundians hold poorly paid jobs, Burundians have babies with low birth weight, Alans have very white teeth, and so on. And we varied whether these were presented as claims about an essentialized category, where we presented biological explanations or internalist explanations. For example, they have babies with low birth weight because of some genetic characteristics of this group. Or they have babies with low birth weight because in this community, they do not have access to adequate prenatal care. And in both cases, adults accepted generics. They recognized that a given phrase like this can have multiple meanings. And we were able to shape and shift this meaning by providing different explanations. So in other words, you could hear something like Burundians hold poorly paid jobs, and you realize that it could mean that it's a product of their nature, they are lazy and non-ambitious, but they could also read this as Burundians, by virtue of their social position in this country, with the barriers for achievement, end up with poorly paid jobs. And this is important, not just because of potential social benefits from structural control of generics. Fundamentally, it's also a claim about how we represent categories and their properties, and how in communication we package this information linguistically to transmit both statistical and causal explanatory content. So finally, let's look at another piece of this puzzle about how the internalist and structural construals work to see, let's look at how they support generalization. So we predicted that both of them should support generalization. To remind you, we think that people can endorse different causal models that lead to the same prediction, where certain property generalizes across category members. In this study, we again introduced adults to Burundians who learned a bunch of their properties, such as hold poorly paid jobs, so again, sunburn easily, or follow a vegetarian diet, received either an internalist explanation. For example, for vegetarian diet, it could be explained by deficiency in digestive enzymes required for digesting meat, or a structural explanation by citing special access to municipal subsidies to purchase vegetables directly from local farmers. And then we asked participants to make a generalization judgment. We would say, here's Ads. Ads is a Burundian and lives in Kemi. Do you think Ads holds a poorly paid job? Do you think Ads follows vegetarian diet? And so on. Now, this is the case of a confound. So this person is a Burundian and lives in Kemi, where Burundians are stuck in their social position. Luckily, in an experiment, we can deconfound the social category and social position. So we also asked questions about a person who is a Burundian, but moved away and lives in a different country. So they're still a Burundian, but they're in a different social position. They're not subjected to these the same constraints. Kind of like when I moved from Berkeley to Princeton and then back to California, I found myself affected by different structural constraints in the form of having to pay for composting or not. We also asked participants about cases where someone was born to a different group, members of different group, but then was adopted into the Burundian community and basically lives as a Burundian, subjected to all the same constraints. And then we had a sanity check, someone who's not a Burundian and does not live in Kemi. And again, just to summarize so for all of these conditions we asked, do you think the property generalizes? To summarize the key findings, when a property was presented under the internalist construal, the generalization patterns basically tracked category membership and people did not care about the social position. They didn't care where you live, they just cared about whether this person is a Burundian. So they generalized to these two cases and not to these two cases. In contrast, when we offered the structural construal, participants' expectations track the shared position. Participants generalized to these two people and not to those two people. So both construals support generalization when the category and position are confounded in this case, but they diverge once we deconfound the category and the position. So we see that an internalist construal favors generalization across changes in social position, and a structural construal is less sensitive to the preservation of category membership. So across these three studies, we document different profiles for the two profiles for internalist and structural reasoning. They converge in some judgments and they diverge in others. So far, we've seen an undifferentiated flexibility in people's construal of social kinds. People can think structurally. We also have shown that contrary to the dominant views, generic language does not necessarily convey or induce essentialist beliefs. We see that both construals are psychologically useful states because you can navigate the world, you can make predictions, you can take advantage of the statistical structure of your environment, but they work differently. And these differences in prediction are revealed most clearly in situations when we are capable of deconfounding category membership and social position. Now, next I want to talk about how this capacity is formed across development, the capacity to reason structurally. I think it's a great, examining it developmentally is a great opportunity to learn more generally about the development of conceptual structure and categorical representation. And also arguably, since it's sometimes structural reasoning, I think, as I'll show you later, might be associated with certain social benefits, understanding how it develops might maybe help us to design interventions that might help us help children sometimes maybe to make reasoning about social groups more flexible, which is arguably a good thing. Now, there is evidence there are reasons to believe that young children might struggle with structural thinking. For example, 4- and 5-year-old children have been shown to essentialize social categories, some social categories, even when they live in a culture that seems to discourage that. So if they do not get it from their community, it seems like they're just predisposed to reason in an essentialist way. There's also evidence that sometimes they have trouble acknowledging environmental influences, and they sometimes prefer inherent explanations of categorical patterns over extrinsic. And in general, you could argue that children might struggle with representing abstract relations and structure-wide counterfactuals that are required, that are prerequisites for structural thought. Well, now to be clear, of course, young children are great at imagining all sorts of fantastic worlds with flying unicorns and no gravity. But I think this kind of all rules are off capacity to imagine a fantastic world is different from thinking in a more organized way, imagining, well, what if we had different rules, if we had different norms, if the social structure were different, if the starting economic position was different. What are the consequences of these small tweaks in the world that we live in? I think that might be different from just imagining flying unicorns. Now, On the other hand, existing evidence also points to some reasons to believe that kids should be perfectly fine with reasoning structurally. For example, kids of the same age often use situational information and explanation and prediction, and actually some studies show that they're better at it than adults and older children. They acknowledge that their own behavior and behavior of others is constrained by common norms, and they're more flexible than adults about some social categories such as race. And more broadly, they seem to be less biased by prior assumptions about causal models than adults. They're more open to exploring alternative causal models. So as adults, we seem to have honed in on a certain small set of explanations and causal models. This is how the world works, and everything else is kind of crazy. Kids are more open to a broad variety of causal stories, and they are more receptive to new evidence. So they might be more open to learning this slightly less conventional causal stories as well. So with children, just like with adults, we can derive several predictions about how children could reason about properties of social groups, depending on whether they construe them as properties of category essence or the social position. So if they endorse the internalist thinking, attributing properties to category essence, they should explain those properties with internalist explanations. And if they attribute them to the social position, they should generate explanations that look more structural. The properties should also appear more mutable if they are construed structurally. Again, just like with adults, we expect that both construals should support formal explanations, generic statements, and generalization. In addition, with children, we looked at children's intuitions about heritability of group properties. And we expected that under the essential construal, the properties should appear heritable, and under the structural, they should appear less heritable. I will show you, I will talk about two studies. I will talk about study 4 in some detail, and then just give you highlights from study 5 that each cover half of these predictions. So in study 4, we tested children from 3 to 6 years of age, and also a control group of adults. We introduced all participants to a new category property association. It was not entirely new because it was an association between gender and color, but the color, or a specific game, but the color and the game itself were not the traditional gender-based association. So participants learned that girls play yellow ball, and they also learned that boys play green ball. And we offered either an internalist or structural framing, and we had to do it in a way that even 3-year-olds could understand. So we came up with a story where certain physical constraints varied. So this is how it went. Participants heard a story about a school with a girl classroom and a boy classroom. And I felt horrible teaching kids about gender segregated classrooms, but science requires sacrifice, so I did it. And then participants learned that during recess, all kids go outside to play one of 2 games, either yellow ball or green ball, and it's a 1-person game, so each kid gets a ball to play with. And the school has a special way of deciding which game each kid is going to play on a given day. So the teacher sets up 2 buckets in each classroom. 1 bucket is yellow, 1 is green. And on the way out, each kid stops and throws a pebble towards the 2 buckets that stand right next to each other. If your pebble falls into the yellow bucket, then you're going to play yellow ball that day. And if your pebble falls into the green bucket, then you're going to play the green ball that day. And then participants learned that these are the games that the girls in the girl classroom played one day. You see mostly yellow, and then another day, and then another day. So there's a clear statistical evidence that there is an association between a property and a category, between being a girl and playing yellow. And for the boys, they learn that they play mostly green. Now, in the internalist condition, both buckets and the 2 classrooms were of the same size. By doing this, we wanted to invite participants to infer that the correlation between category membership and game choice was the product of inherent preferences. So basically, if it's equally easy to get your pebble into either bucket, but we see such a strong deviation from chance performance, some force must be pushing girls towards the yellow bucket. What force is that? It's probably their preference. They're aiming for that yellow bucket. And again, we have evidence that even younger kids can do this, this type of inference. Now, in the structural condition, one bucket was instead much larger than the other. In the girls' classroom, the yellow bucket was huge and the green bucket was tiny, and vice versa in the boys' classroom. And this size difference imposes a stable structural constraint on the probability distribution over options available to members of each category. In other words, inviting a structural interpretation of the category property connection. So to recap, everyone learns the same association, but we offer different information about existence of structural constraints on choices. Under the internalist construal, we expect that they would attach this new property to being a girl. So now we know that also that girls play yellow ball. But in the structural condition, we expect that they would attach the property of playing yellow ball, and they have this. So the property will be attached to the social position, the girls' classroom, with its own affordances. And if we succeed in doing that, then when we ask them why do girls play yellow ball, then they should say something about girls in the internalist condition. They love yellow, and they should say something about the affordances and the classroom in the structural condition. For example, it's easier for them in their classroom. So first, let's look at how that prediction fares. So we did precisely that. We asked participants, why do girls play yellow ball a lot? And then we coded the explanations as internalist if they said things like girls like yellow, or structural if they said things like yellow bucket is bigger in the girls' classroom. So I'm going to show you the percentage of participants that generated each explanation type split by the two framing types. This is the internalist framing where the buckets are the same size, structural framing where the buckets are of different sizes, and then we're further splitting the data by age within each condition. And I will show you internalist explanation, the proportion of internalist explanation, percentage as gray bars, and structure explanations will be in black. So first, let's look at the internalist framing condition only, the left panel. As expected, participants produced predominantly in internalist explanations and no structural explanations, although a couple of adults invented some. Now let's see what happens to internalist explanations, these gray bars, in the structural framing condition. They decrease with age. Now let's look at what happens with the structural explanations, the black bars in this condition. They increase with age, so that the initial preference for internalist explanations in the younger age group flipped to a preference for structural explanations for older children. Now, critically, despite the developmental change in the structural condition, some proportion of participants in each age group produced structural explanations. So overall, we are seeing that the framing definitely shapes how we explain properties, and we see some developmental changes there. Let's look at the intuitions about mutability of properties across contexts. So if yellow were not more available to girls, what would happen? We would expect in the internalist condition, they would basically be playing yellow ball no matter what. If this is the property that stems from core inherent preference, you're going to carry it with you no matter what, even in the new context. But if it's framed structurally, then you would say, if the constraints are relaxed, the outcome might also be different. To probe this intuition, we told participants that now the school rules have changed. Now anyone can go to any classroom, and here Susie's parents decided that she'll be going to the boys' classroom, and here she is. And the picture here would match the condition, the framing condition that the participant was in. And we just asked, so it's her turn to go to recess. Which game do you think she will play today? The yellow ball or the green ball? And if they pick yellow, we would also say for sure yellow or maybe yellow. And if they pick green, we would also use the same follow-up. So we have this 4-point scale in mutability ranging from for sure she's going to play yellow, meaning this property does not change, to for sure she's going to switch to playing green, which is the maximum mutability. And indeed, we see that participants in the structural condition, the black bars, rated the property as more mutable than the participants in the internalist condition. And this held across age groups. Now, finally, let's see how children reason about formal explanations. Just to remind you, we predicted that both construals support them, and we found that for adults they do. Now, for children, translating into this story, Would participants endorse explanation that Lucy plays yellow ball because she's a girl? We expect that in both cases they would. So participants witnessed a riveting conversation between two puppets where Froggy wonders why Lucy plays yellow ball and Doggy says because Lucy is a girl, which is a formal explanation. And then we said, is it a good explanation or a bad explanation? And if they said bad, we said, is it really bad or kind of bad? And if they said good, we said, is it really good or kind of good? So again, we have a 4-point scale ranging from really bad to really good. And these are the ratings that we received in the internalist and structural framing conditions by age group. Now, one thing that might be jumping at you is that adults are giving overall lower ratings to formal explanations. That's a common finding that emerges across different studies. What I want to draw your attention to is that within each age group, the two bars pretty much exactly the same. So just as we predicted, under both construals, the formal explanations are endorsed equally. And this lack of difference here is informative because we know from all the other measures that children and adults respond very differently in these two conditions. It was only for this task where we predicted a convergence between the two conditions, and this is precisely what we see. So overall, we are seeing some age general effects. We see that all age groups are capable of structural thinking as manifested in their open-ended explanations and mutability ratings. We also see that formal explanations support two interpretations, internalist and structural, from 3 years and up. And we are seeing some developmental change such that adults and older children engage in structural thinking more readily, at least when they're asked to formulate structural explanations themselves. And we can also see methodologically that we can induce these two construals effectively across ages with appropriate paradigms. All right, so we've checked the first 3 predictions. Now let's look at generalization, generics, and heritability. And I'll just give you highlights from study 5. And we are going to, so this study is primarily about generic language, and we are looking at generic language differently from how we looked at it before. From the question of what generics mean, we move on to ask what generics do to us. So in previous studies, again, we looked at generic language as kind of an outcome variable. How different construals support endorsement and generation of generic language. In this study, we focus on the causal role of generic language in shaping our categorical representations. So prior research has argued convincingly that generic language has a powerful influence on learners, pushing them towards forming essentialist representations. So for example, Rhodes and colleagues taught adults and children novel social categories using either generic language like Zarpi sleep in tall trees, or a variety of non-generic language, for example, specific claims like this Zarpi sleeps in tall trees. And then they measured their essentialist beliefs through generalization, explanation, and inheritance measures. And they report strong evidence that generic language is a mechanism by which social essentialist beliefs can be transmitted from parents to children. Hearing generic languages about a novel social category led both preschool-age children and adults in our samples to develop essentialist beliefs about our category, about the category. Now, maybe it's not about generics per se, but maybe just one of the 2 possible interpretations that drives these effects. Maybe it only happens when we think that the generic is talking about the category per se. So what if we give people the tools to reinterpret the generics? Maybe we can avoid the pernicious consequences. And we already know that adults can see that generics might mean different things. Now, it's really interesting what's going to happen, whether children can see the same ambiguity, because otherwise, if I say women have trouble getting jobs in math, to mean, like as a social critique, to mean there is a problem with our society, but what the person on the receiving end of what the child is capable of hearing, well, I probably wouldn't be talking about like tenure track math positions, but kind of in general, if I make a claim about the social position, but what the child hears is a claim about the essentialized category, that really opens the door to some possible tragic perpetuation of stereotypes against the will of the speaker. So let's see if children are capable of interpreting generics in a non-essentialist way. So to test this question, we ran a modified version of Rhodes et al. Study. In one condition, we actually replicated their version. I'm going to call it plain generic language. We again taught participants that Zarpies sleep in tall trees and Zarpies look up as they walk and they speak loudly. And then in another condition, we used the exact same language to teach children about this group, but we added a structural framing. We added information about their environments. We said, Zarpies live in the land of giants. Now, suddenly, this kind of presents all these features in the new light. You can think, well, it makes sense for them to look up as they walk so that they can spot the giants so they don't step on them, or sleep in tall trees so they don't get squished at night. It also makes sense that they speak loudly to be heard by the giants. It's not that they, look up as they walk and speak loudly just because they're loud and obnoxious. So this was the main comparison. We also had a specific control condition as Rhodes and colleagues. But the main question was whether the two generic conditions, plain and structural, would behave differently, even though the children are learning from exact same linguistic input in both of them. And we found that when we asked participants to explain new properties that we didn't teach them about, like Zarpies paint their hair colorful with sparkling colors, or they tie bells to the shoelaces. Participants' explanations in the plain generic language were about Zarpies because they want to look beautiful. But in the structural generic condition, the explanations were about giants, like because this way giants can see them. We also added the generalization measure. We expected both conditions to support generalization. So again, we taught them a new property of one Zarpie. We said this Zarpie is really good at climbing tall fences. And we wanted to see if participants have the intuition that the property is homogeneous within a category. So we said, here are two other Zarpies. Do you think they're both of them are good at climbing tall fences, or only one of them, or both are not good? And we see that both conditions support generalization. And finally, when we asked participants to reason about property heritability by telling them stories about a baby who born to a Zarpie mom who looks up when she walks, but right after birth is adopted and by a parent that belongs to a different category who looks down when she walks, we asked them, when this baby grows up, do you think the baby will look up when they walk, or down? In the plain generic language condition, participants expect the baby to develop the properties of the birth parent, but they expect that the baby will develop properties of the adoptive parent in the generic language plus structural framing condition. So even though all participants in this study hear generic language, when generics are accompanied by structural cues, they do not form essentialized category representations, which I think is a bit of good news that we all need. So far, these are the, we've tested a variety of predictions about how these two construals should behave, which brings us to the most important question of the whole project. So what? So in other words, we've shown that children and adults can think structurally, but does it make any difference to how they treat other people? And the final study that I'll describe looks at social consequences of structural thinking. And here is a little question for you. So for example, imagine you learn about two groups of children who go to the blue school and children who go to the green school. And you have 6 pies donated by the bakery, and you need to divide the pies between the two groups. So think how you would do that. Now it's kind of hard to do audience participation over Zoom, but I assume many of you think that it's appropriate to do an equal split, right? 3 and 3. Now, what if I told you that the kids in the blue school already have 5 pies and the kids in the green school already have 1 pie? Now, you still have to divide 6 new pies. At least you can start maybe seeing that there are more valid ways to divide the pies. You might focus on the fact these are new pies completely. Maybe I should still stick with 3 and 3, but you might also consider the possibility of instead of dividing the new pies equally, you could say maybe I should aim for equality in pies after the new pies are distributed. So maybe I should give more pies to the group that has less to begin with. Now, we wanted to play with this kind of space of possibilities and check whether the way we explain the initial inequality affects how you're going to divide the new pies, how you're going to allocate resources. So there is prior research that looks at the way people think about and explain poverty and documented that that has influence on the actions we take. The research mainly focused on either presence or absence of an internalist explanation of poverty. So when inequality is attributed to internal causes, for example, when achievement gap is explained by effort, like explaining racial SES gaps in terms of motivation and effort, that type of explanation leads to negative attitudes to poor people, seeing them as less competent, less attractive, promotes higher acceptance of social stratification and denying the need for change, low endorsement of governmental support programs, and perpetuating inequality by allocating more resources to meritorious groups who already have more. And the question in this study was whether by providing structural explanations that attribute inequality to structural factors, we can promote rectification inequality. Excuse me. When children as young as 4 or 5 allocate resources, compared to cases when we explain the inequality by citing some internal factors or providing no explanation. So all participants witnessed basically the same scenario that I described before, where kids in one school already have 5 pies and kids in the other school have 1 pie, and participants had to divide new pies donated by a local bakery. And we varied participants' beliefs about why one group has more and why the other group has less. In one condition, we explained the difference by effort. We said that the kids in the blue school worked really hard to bake those pies, they baked them all, whereas the kids in the green school kind of sloppily made 1 pie and instead of baking more pies, just ran out to play in the yard. In the resource condition, we explained the difference by the amount of resources that the schools have. We said that the blue school is rich and has a lot of money and could buy lots of boxes with ingredients for pies. It bought 5 boxes with flour and sugar and butter. And the blue school is poor, it could only buy 1 box with ingredients for its kids to make pies. But otherwise, kids worked equally hard, they're equally good at baking and so on. And as a control condition, we had one version of the story where we didn't say anything about why there is a difference to probe the baseline intuitions, the explanations that people would maybe themselves generate for a disparity. And when participants divide new pies, in the no explanation condition, we expected that based on prior research with this age group, with 4 and 5-year-old kids, that kids would divide them equally. Then also based on prior research, we expected that when we explain inequality by differences in merit, that the hardworking group would be rewarded. That's also based on prior work. Now, the most interesting question was about what would happen in the condition where the explanation cites structural differences in access to resources. Again, at this age, typically children do not rectify. So especially the younger end, 3s and 4s, they tend to prefer equal allocation no matter what. It's as if they learn that equal division is good and they ignore all the other factors. So it would be particularly striking if the structural condition would make them rectify the inequality. Now, the actual division task was set up in a way that makes it easy for children to pick a variety of possible allocation scenarios. So they all learned that they have to divide 6 new pies, and then we showed them 5 different ways of dividing the pies, and we counterbalanced the order in which these things appear and the side of the screen and everything possible. But kids could just point to one of the ways of dividing the pies, ranging from 5 to the, in this case, from 5 to the blue school and 1 to the green school, all the way to 1 to the blue school and 5 to the green school. And kids actually rarely picked any of these 4-2 to 4 allocations. So I'm going to present the results by showing you the proportion of times when they picked equal allocation or when they gave more to the rich group, the pie rich group, and when they gave more to the group that's pie poor prior to the allocation. And these are the results in the baseline. As expected, the majority of children divided the pies equally, ignoring the initial starting inequality. In the effort condition, there was a slight shift towards giving more to the pie-rich school, but it was not a significant shift. Prior research documented that children of this age do go through this shift, so I would not make much of the non-significant result. Now, the most important question is what's going to happen in the structural condition. And we see that now children are predominantly rectifying the inequality and giving more pies to the school that had less to begin with. We also tested adults as a comparison group. We see that they start out already predominantly rectifying, which was great to see. Now, this is not the maximum they can do, because when you offer the structural construal, then they start rectifying even more, and they abandon largely the equal allocation strategy. Interestingly, the effort-based explanation flips their allocation preferences, so they start rewarding the hardworking group. So if we look at the mean number of pies that the green school received, the school with fewer pies, only in the structural condition, children gave more than chance, more than half of the pies on average. Adults always deviated from the chance, but in different directions. And again, they gave most when we offered the structural construal. Now, in addition to these behaviors, allocation behaviors, we wanted to probe normative intuitions about what people think is okay, because it's one thing to kind of make one choice. I could say, I'm going to choose chocolate ice cream over vanilla, but I don't think it's wrong to pick vanilla. We wanted to see whether on top of this just preferences, there's also an intuition that one way of dividing the resources is more right than the other. So we asked, if someone wanted to give more to the blue school, is it okay or not okay to do that? If someone wanted to give more to the green school, is it okay or not okay? And plotting this average evaluations from really not okay to really okay, children in the baseline and the effort condition, they basically said both of these strategies are equally kind of middling okay. But in the structural condition, they developed pronounced normative intuitions, thinking that it was okay to give more to the poor school and it was not okay to give more to the rich. And both of these were different from chance. Adults, again, always had some normative intuitions. The baseline intuitions favored giving more to the poor school. These intuitions were strengthened by the structural construal and reversed by the effort merit-based construal. We also had an additional measure that I'll just summarize for you. When we asked participants, who would you rather be friends with, kids from the blue school or kids from the green school, we found that the structural framing shifted the preferences a little bit towards preferring the pie poor group as friendship targets. So overall, we are seeing that under the conditions of starting inequality, structural construal promotes resource allocations that rectify inequalities and willingness for social contact with members of disadvantaged groups. So to summarize, across 6 studies, we document some differences between the two construals, but also some interesting similarities where they overlap. So in general, we are seeing that people possess the cognitive machinery for thinking about the social world in a flexible, non-essentializing and non-stereotyping ways. We can represent and explain properties of social groups as products of stable structural constraints. And we're seeing first signs of structural thinking at age 3 and developmental changes through adulthood. I think this has interesting real practical implications. I think our data on increased expectations of mutability across contexts suggests that people might be more willing to consider social change when they endorse the structural construal. So, and we, so in this case, I'm just imagining some kind of real, some scenarios for real life implications. So for example, when a woman or a member of a certain race applies for a position where statistics suggest that people of this group membership are more likely statistically to fail or drop out, if the hiring committee realizes that the property of dropping out is a product of the social position rather than the product of being a woman or being a member of that racial group, then they might also realize that if they create a favorable social environment for that person in the organization, then the property of dropping out might not generalize to her anymore, which I think might be a positive outcome. We've also shown that structural control promotes fair resource allocation across groups and encourages social contact with members of disadvantaged groups. Now, there is a lot more that can be and should be done, I think. I think we can learn a lot more about how the roles that structural thinking can play in for navigating the social world, whether it can offer help to children or adults to when they need to make sense of stable statistical associations observed in a given environment. Our results suggest that they can do this. They can grasp the existing associations without necessarily representing them as inherent and immutable. Again, you can imagine a young girl who sees that there are few women in math, but everyone around her tells her, for example, that women and men are equally good, so well-meaning parents and teachers. Now, that might seem to contradict her observations. And even if she believes her parents, there is a risk that if she endorses the internalist model, then when she gets more correlational data, she actually does not get to see many women in these professions. That might eventually outweigh the parents' testimony. And what structural explanation does is different. It acknowledges, like, yes, there are fewer women in math, but that doesn't have anything to do with inherent or deep-seated inclinations of women. That might give that girl tools to process new evidence, to accommodate it within the structural causal model. Now, I'm also, so I've been talking about social categories exclusively here. In general, I think structural thinking is a capacity to consider complex systems with multiple relations, and where the relations impose constraints on the states of its elements. That's a much broader topic than just reasoning about society. And I think many of these cognitive representations and skills are employed in reasoning about a variety of complex systems. And we need these capacities to understand many systems in science. So I have some developmental work and also work with adults that looks at how people reason about physical and biological systems that depend on the state of background variables. One ongoing project that we have also examines the implications of structural explanations for reasoning about success and failure and kind of interaction with growth mindset. So if you're familiar with growth mindset, it's the idea that when you are failing, it's good to adopt the mindset of flexible, malleable, cognitive capacity. So if I fail, it's not at this math test, it's not because I'm dumb, it's because maybe I didn't work hard enough. And if I invest more effort, I will improve, which is a productive and helpful message. But I think it has its limitations because it's still an internalist explanation, except instead of attributing level of performance to talent or intellect, it now attributes performance to level of effort. And in some cases, when effort is not the only determinant of performance, that might be misleading. Imagine a child who's not doing well at school, who's also subject to all sorts of structural constraints. You know, their family is poor, they don't have the computer or the right books, they even have to work at home to help their family business. Like telling that child that you're not succeeding because you're not working hard enough, that kind of misses the point. And also telling people who are succeeding, but they're also riding on the way of additional affordances that come with their social position, that hard work is primary determinant of success, again, could backfire. And indeed, we have evidence that emphasizing growth mindset for people who succeed under privilege makes them ignore disadvantage of others more, which I think an interesting further direction. So one direction that I'm very interested in exploring but haven't done much, so we're talking with Clark about looking at implications of considering kind of broader circumstances and acknowledging constraints on one's choice architecture for how we evaluate perceived freedom for ourselves and for others. And some of the capacities of structural thinking, I think, will be playing into this evaluations. More broadly, I'm interested in questions about universality of structural thinking. So oftentimes when I talk about this work, people ask, well, what's the default? Isn't it that essentialist thinking is kind of the default way, and then we need to work hard to overcome it? And I think the story is much more complicated than that. And the short answer is we do not know what the default is, because we haven't been able to look at people who haven't been exposed to any sort of cultural input that might bias them towards one way of thinking or another. Also, if it's a default, we don't know what form it takes. Is it that, if let's say internalist thinking is the default, is it that literally it like takes fewer calories in your brain to consider an internalist explanation than to consider a structural explanation? Or is it that we have developed over time a preference for certain type of causal models and explanations, kind of this abstract over hypothesis that tell us consider that class of models and not that class of models, these are more likely? Both are forms of default, but they come from very different sources. And I'm interested in learning more about how cross-cultural work could address these questions. And then finally, to wrap up, I just want to mention one direction that I'm interested in developing. I'm not an expert at all, but very intrigued by, and it has a special connection to UCLA, because this direction was developed when I attended Diverse Intelligence's Summer Institute, organized by Erica Cartmel and Jacob Foster. Work, and it encourages interdisciplinary work. So I was able to join forces with a bunch of colleagues who actually work with non-human primates, and I know nothing about them, but people working together with Chris Krupanian, Karina Most, and Josephine Hubbard and Rachna Reddy, we were developed a research proposal to look at kind of elements of structural thinking in chimps. And the main question of that project is whether non-human primates, chimps specifically, can represent social hierarchies as separate from individuals. So when you think that someone is high ranking versus low ranking, whether you think that these are inherent power differential that's specific to these individuals, or whether there is a separate representation of social positions that kind of can be used for reasoning about the society that is separable from individuals who happen to occupy those positions. And that's it. I want to thank my collaborators and my research assistants, and I also want to thank Clark for inviting me to talk to you, and I look forward to answering your questions and hearing your ideas.
Thank you so much, Nadya. Let's thank Nadya for a great talk. And now we have some time for questions. The ideal thing is to raise your blue hand, which you can do by going to the participant link at the bottom of your screen and raising your hand. I will keep a list and I will call on you in order. So first we have Renee.
Hey there. Thank you so much for this talk. I thought it was really interesting and potentially has really important consequences too. So I had a question about the type of information that you offered participants in your experiments when you were giving them some environmental explanation of the behaviors of, for example, the Zarpies. When you said the Zarpies look up and they live in an environment with giants. I was wondering, do you think it matters that there's a potentially logical explanation for why the living with giants results in people walking and looking up? Or is it that when you say anything at all about the environment, this kind of invites a structural explanation, regardless of whether it really obviously makes sense that the environment lets people to look up?
Thank you for the question. I think broadly it actually, so I think I can answer specifically to this experiment versus more broadly about how it works in our minds. I think specifically with children, if we just mention that there is an environment and it has some properties that are not easy to tie to explaining these particular properties, I think that would be very hard for children to make this connection. But this is just kind of a practical limitation. An interesting question is whether there is anything like structural kind of mindset. If you can just kind of prime people, think about the environment. Could there be any characteristics of the environment that could be tied to explaining these properties? And I'm not going to tell you what those properties are, but can you imagine? I'm going to tell you about some different characteristics of the environment. I think that's a fascinating question. I think actually it has, so we have some evidence from another study that I didn't present, that there's some kind of a little bit of this mindset where people can go beyond the information that we provided to them. So for example, in the pie sharing study, we also asked at some point, do you think these groups would have different number of kites? And we never told them about like what you make kites from, how the boxes with flour are relevant for making kites. But we could already, children generalized their expectation that the schools will also differ in the amount of toys they have, the kites and other resources. So there's some tentative evidence that kind of in general making you think about non-internalist explanations or about the environment might be helpful, but it's very weak. I think your question is more interesting than my answer.
Well, thank you very much for answering my question. Also, I was thinking your work reminds me of Christina Moya's work. I believe she has done some somewhat similar experiments in Peru. So that might be interesting to look at.
It sounds like something I should know, but I don't.
I'll type her name in the chat.
Great, thank you. So our next question is from Andrew.
Hi, first, thanks for a super interesting talk. I'm going to be at the chat later, so I'll try to keep this brief. But I was interested in, you've got this illustration of people being capable of both, structural thinking and reasoning and internalist thinking and reasoning. And I guess, there are interesting questions about what's happening at the level of the individual, but at the level of, population dynamics of this type of reasoning, what determines when people shift from one to the other at the level of the population? So as an illustration of the type of thing I'm thinking of, as, a Jewish person, there's a historical reason for the associations between, Jews and like money, right? So if you appreciate sort of the like historical context, there were constraints on the types of jobs that Jews in Europe were able to do, and so they were sort of funneled into this position. And you could imagine that at that point in history, there would have been a structuralist explanation might have been a lot more appealing to make sense of that. But as you sort of move across time, there's this shift into more essentialist thinking. So can you say anything about these sort of like population level dynamics in structural versus internalist thinking?
That's fascinating, and I wish I were able to say anything informative. I don't know how these and if these changes happen. Like this, one possibility would be, again, if there is some cognitive default, there might be some sort of slippage over time. Like, yeah, I learned some specific evidence information that in this socio-historical context that allowed me to revise this, like allowed me to break away from essentialist thinking. But then over time, generations forgot what happened, and then we reverted. Now, first of all, I'm not even sure that there is anything like the essentialist default. And depending on what subset of data you're looking at, you might get evidence for essentialist default or against it. In many of my studies, for example, we are seeing that even in cases where children are spontaneously generating essentialist explanations more than structural, at the same time, when you're providing these explanations to them, the level of kind of receptivity, how much they're responding to it, how much they're adjusting their responses, that doesn't vary much between 3-year-olds and adults. So I'm actually, I think that probably both ways of thinking are viable early on, and we just kind of get trained in more in one than the other. But this is a speculation at this point. And I'm definitely don't know how to explain kind of population level shifts. And that's, one of the reasons I'm here to learn more about how to think about this type of questions. So hopefully we can continue this conversation maybe in the following meeting.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks. Next, we have a question from Dan and then Brian.
Thanks, Nadia. So first, I second Renee's suggestion that you familiarize yourself with Christina Moya's work, and to very briefly summarize it. She works in an ethnically plural region in which ethnicity is a poor predictor of people's behavior and occupation is a better predictor. Adults then follow a structuralist line of reasoning using like an adoption paradigm and so on, but children do not. So her evidence actually speaks directly against your suggestion that at a minimum, there is no initial bias, and it's just the set of explanations that you're exposed to in the course of enculturation. Because in that context, children are getting exactly the opposite message from what they actually evince. So that would argue for the internalist being the default. And it's very easy to sit on the couch and kibitz and say, well, you should do this or you should do that, or, nitpick the details of an experiment. But that work of hers has the advantage of ecological validity relative to a lot of what you've described, because the kids are reasoning about a social world in which they actually live. And that brings me to my question / comment, which is that when you provide, so throughout these experiments, your evidence for the absence of a default for internalist is that when you present children with generic construals of the situation, they don't show a bias toward internalist reasoning. But the problem with those kinds of generic descriptions is that there are no costs to getting it wrong, as it were, right? And at least within the kind of gene culture coevolution literature, one primary theoretical explanation for why we would expect internalist approaches to be the default is that essentializing has powerful capacities for inductive inference and reasoning about cultural groups. and that has real fitness consequences for individuals. And thus that the evolved psychology has tracked the cultural evolution of ethnic markers and the importance of cooperation and coordination within culturally homogeneous groups of individuals. So I guess my long-winded remarks then lead me to the suggestion that were the default to be tested with presentations of information in which there are costs to getting it wrong, that is, you assume a structuralist explanation when in fact a default, an internalist explanation is more accurate, that you would then start to see the pattern shift towards the internalist, right? And that it would shift more easily in that direction than the converse, when you create the error asymmetries in a direction that would favor structuralism, right? Because that is what I'm trying to do in the experimental design, is to replicate arguably the costs of getting it wrong in the real world, right? Where when you fail to accurately predict other people's behavior, there are real consequences to it.
Thank you. This is super interesting. I think I really like the idea of cost, and I think there can be different types of costs, and some of them come in terms of prediction error, but that's not the only type of cost that we might be facing. So in general, I think we might be able to make accurate predictions based on different causal models, and sometimes even a false causal model can produce accurate prediction. So I think there are many cases when just looking at your accuracy of prediction, precisely because we live in the case of confounded world, might not help you differentiate between causal models. So for example, you can often accurately predict crime rate from race, or how the chances that a person would violate bail or some similar outcome. Now, someone could take the essentialist causal model about predisposition to criminality in certain racial groups and make accurate predictions about crime rate. Someone could take a structural model and also make accurate predictions. So in this case, the ability to make accurate prediction does not help us to choose one of the two models, unless we also have somehow have access to counterfactual worlds of how this racial group would perform under different conditions, not in a racially biased society. So I think I would really like to understand better how certain evolutionary pressures could work in such situations. Is it that basically there is no evolutionary pressure to find the truth as long as you have a causal model that works well in the kind of environment where you live, where social group position and social category membership are confounded? Or if there are additional pressures precisely because our environment has changed over time and we have adapted to living in different kinds of societies, you want to have the causal model that will make the right prediction in case there is a social change, in case the society we live in is not racist anymore. And so speaking of, when the cost is only measured in the accurate predictions, if I just do check marks, you predicted, you looked at race, you made an accurate prediction for this person, for that person, I think that really limits the actual cost that we are dealing with, because if someone is wrongly convicted or not given opportunity to leave on bail or something, it's kind of more wrong if the actual explanation is structural, right? So I think we need to maybe consider those moral costs as well, but I don't know how evolution works with estimating moral costs. In general, in science, we often need to, even if we have a model that works well, like Ptolemaic explanation of solar system made accurate predictions, we still thought that there was some benefit to switching to Copernicus because it's more true. And I don't know if evolutionary pressure would push us towards one or the other.
Yeah, I should clarify very briefly, because I know Brian wants to participate also. When I say selection having, favored towards an outcome that produces lower costs, that is specifically for the welfare of the individual. And moral considerations and group level processes can be entirely different. Empirically, treating ethnic markers as if they were indicative of biologically inherent characteristics of individuals is, of course, over not only current time, but evolutionary time, empirically wrong, but it leads to fitness enhancing behavior on the part of individuals who preferentially assort with members of the same cultural group, right?
But so, they could achieve the same outcome with a structural causal model.
Potentially, and this is where potentially path dependence matters, in that probably essentialist reasoning was already there for interspecific interactions, and natural selection is a tinkerer, not an engineer. But we're running out of time, and I want to hear from Brian, so I'm going to yield the floor.
Thank you. Brian, go ahead.
Hi, Nadya. Thank you so much for that presentation, and welcome to the department. It'll be great to see how your work with Clark evolves in your time here. So I'm a human behavioral ecologist, and so maybe in a similar way that Dan was, I'm thinking about some of the real world implications of these different modes of reasoning. And it strikes me that, in the sort of more complex, uncontrolled environment that, most people live their lives within, it seems difficult to imagine a situation where it would be evolutionarily advantageous to adopt one or the other mode of thinking, or for a developmental trajectory to exist that doesn't involve capacities to reason and weighting both considerations. Like a very simple example would be, a very small child reasoning about the environment around them, an outcome like, there's a rock, and that they might like to move. Part of the reason why they can't move a rock would be because they are a child and they have this essential internal state of being a smaller and weaker individual. Another property is that the rock is heavy. And so I can't think of any kind of archetypal situation where not having both kinds of reasoning interacting with one another would be useful. And so when I see experiments set up with, with a framing where you have two competing hypotheses of, either an essentialist, internalist perspective or a structural environmental sort of explanation, I wonder, what is the cost? I wonder if you could talk about, what's the costs and benefits of setting up the work that way? I mean, I'm sure it helps for interpreting your results. Perhaps it makes it simpler, but I'm just also wondering, are you chasing a kind of answer that won't necessarily speak to the possibility of a third null hypothesis or competing hypothesis, which is that both forms of reasoning are being integrated into very simple expectations and views of day-to-day life.
Thank you for this question, and I'm actually absolutely sympathetic with this, and I agree with you that probably people have both, and it's advantageous to have both. That's why it's surprising that most of the field of psychology has taken this strong stance of primacy of only one way of thinking. I would want to argue precisely what you said, that both are available, and we gain most by being flexible and applying them and combining them in sophisticated ways. The way this talk is structured maybe paints a picture of focusing too much on the dichotomy, but I need to do this as a strategic response given the situation in the field. Like I need to show, if we predominantly focused on A, I want to say, hey, B also exists. And I want to show that, provide an existence proof. People are capable of doing this as well. Even children can, if we make it easy enough. In reality, I think we use both of them, and that's what, and we probably combine very interesting, combine them in interesting and complex causal stories. For example, even reasoning about, so when you reason about society, you could also have a perfect niche story where the current social positions we have, they simply reflect the initial predispositions of these group members, right? So you could say the internalist factors caused the structural factors. You could also have a different story where structural factors maybe caused internalist characteristics. So you could say, depending on the early environment and constraints that you face when the person is forming or a group is forming, now they have developed this inherent characteristics. You can have much more, there is no limit on how complex of a story you can have, incorporating different types of factors, and sometimes really seeing them as not A affecting B, but one is a part of the other. In reality, I think all of this is happening, and we need to start working our way to understanding human reasoning in all its complexity. It's just, so my maybe framing of in this presentation is more of a response of this one-sided presentation that has been dominating in many of psychological, in much of psychological work. So it's a response reaction that I wish I didn't have to frame it that way.
Great, thank you. Before we thank Nadya and wrap up, let me just remind those of you who signed up to talk to Nadya that she's generously agreed to meet with a group of the students after this at about 1:45. I won't be there, but Nadya will host that meeting, and I'm going to create a Zoom link that I'll send to all the students who have signed up for that discussion. So check your email right after this, and I'll send the Zoom link in email. And with that, if you'd like to unmute yourself and give a round of applause, let's all thank Nadya for a great presentation. Thank you very much, Nadya.
Thank you all for your comments and for listening to me.
Yes, and we look forward to all the continuing conversations, since you're going to be here for the next year in the department. So thanks again. Thanks to you all, and I will see you all next week for Tyler Margettis' talk, same time, same place.